wind carved through the Montana territory like a blade fresh from winter's forge, driving snow so thick that Clara Whitmore could barely see her horse's ears. Her fingers, numb despite the wool mittens, clutched the reins as she squinted through the white veil that had swallowed the world whole. Somewhere in this vast emptiness was supposed to be her destination, the Carter Ranch, where a man named Elias Carter waited for his mail-order bride. Clara had been traveling for 3 days since leaving the last settlement, following directions scrawled on a piece of paper now sodden in her coat pocket. The stagecoach had only taken her so far before the driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, had shaken his head and declared he'd go no further with the weather turning. "You sure about this, miss?" he'd asked, eyeing the threatening sky. "Ain't no place for a lady to be wandering alone, especially with that storm brewing." But Clara had come too far to turn back. The letter in her satchel, creased from countless readings, promised a new life, a husband who needed a wife to help run his ranch and care for his young daughter. After the war had taken everything from her, including her position as a field nurse when the makeshift hospital was shelled, this was her chance to build something again. Now, as the storm unleashed its fury, Clara wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The horse beneath her, a sturdy bay mare she'd bought in the last town, stumbled through a drift that came up to its knees. Clara murmured words of encouragement, though she wasn't sure if they were for the horse or herself. Her traveling dress, practical wool in deep blue, was soaked through despite her heavy coat. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes, and her breath came in sharp puffs that disappeared instantly into the howling wind. Through the swirling snow, she glimpsed a dark shape, angular lines that didn't belong to the natural world. Her heart leaped with relief as she urged the mare forward, praying it wasn't a mirage born of desperation and cold. A house materialized from the storm like something emerging from a dream. It was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Smoke rose from the chimney, barely visible against the white sky. But it was there. Someone was home. Clara dismounted on unsteady legs, her boots sinking into snow that reached halfway to her knees. She led the mare to what appeared to be a hitching post near the porch steps, her movements clumsy with cold and fatigue. The wind tried to steal her breath as she climbed the wooden steps, each one creaking under her weight. She raised her fist to knock, then hesitated. This was it, the moment her new life would begin. In a few minutes, she would meet Elias Carter, the man who would become her husband. They'd exchanged only 3 letters, formal and careful, discussing practical matters like household management and his daughter's needs. She knew he was a widower, that he ran cattle, and that he needed a woman's touch in his home. But what kind of man was he? Would he be kind? Stern? Would he find her acceptable? The wind gave her no choice. It slammed against her back, nearly knocking her off balance, and she pounded on the heavy wooden door with more force than she'd intended. Footsteps approached from within, heavy and deliberate. The door opened, and Clara found herself looking up at a man who was not at all what she'd expected. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe. His hair was dark brown, almost black, with traces of premature silver at the temples. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray as a winter sky and just as cold. They studied her with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply empty. "Sir?" Clara managed, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I believe you're expecting me?" The man's expression didn't change. He looked past her at the storm, then back at her face. "I'm not expecting anyone." Clara's heart sank. Had she misunderstood the directions? "Are you not Elias Carter? This is the Carter Ranch, isn't it?" "No, ma'am. This is the McGraw place. I'm Jonas McGraw." His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. "Carter's Ranch is another 5 miles east." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. 5 miles. In this storm, it might as well have been 50. She looked over her shoulder at the white wall of wind and snow, then back at the man in the doorway. I seem to have lost my way." Jonas McGraw followed her gaze to the storm, and something in his expression shifted slightly. It wasn't warmth, exactly, but perhaps a grudging recognition of reality. Storm's getting worse. Be dark soon. Clara waited, hoping he would extend an invitation, but he simply stood there, one hand on the doorframe. Desperation crept into her voice. "Please, sir, I don't think I can make it any further tonight. If I could just shelter here until the storm passes." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind howling around the porch. Jonas McGraw's gray eyes studied her face as if weighing something. Finally, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Just for the night," he said, his tone making it clear this was not an invitation but a necessity. "Stables around back for your horse." Relief flooded through Clara so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. "Thank you. Truly, We'll see to the horse first," Jonas interrupted, already reaching for his coat from a peg by the door. "Storm like this can kill an animal quick." They struggled through the snow to a sturdy barn behind the house. Jonas moved with efficient purpose, helping Clara unsaddle the mare and settling the animal in a stall with hay and water. He worked in silence, his movements economical and practiced. Clara tried to help, but her numb fingers fumbled with the buckles until Jonas gently took the task from her hands. "Been traveling long?" he asked, the first personal question he'd offered. 3 days, Clara replied, rubbing her hands together to restore feeling. "From Missouri, originally. I was meant to be a bride." Jonas's hands stilled for a moment on the horse's bridle, then continued their work. "Mail order?" The blunt question might have offended some women, but Clara had long since abandoned any pretense about her situation. "Yes, mister. Carter and I have been corresponding for 2 months. Jonas nodded once, as if this explained everything. When they finished with the horse, he led her back to the house through snow that was now coming down so hard Clara couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The interior of the house was a relief from the cold, though not much warmer in atmosphere. A fire burned in a large stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with simple wooden furniture. Everything was clean but spare, functional rather than comfortable. It felt like a house where laughter had once lived but had long since moved away. "Coffee's on the stove," Jonas said, hanging up his coat. "There's bread and some cold beef if you're hungry." Clara shed her own coat, grateful to be out of the wet wool. Her dress was damp but not soaked through, and she smoothed her hands over the skirt, suddenly conscious of how she must look after 3 days of travel. "Thank you, Mr. McGraw. I don't want to impose any more than necessary." "You're not imposing," he replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly pleased about the situation either. "Storm brought you here. Storm will take you away when it's done." As Clara moved toward the kitchen area, she caught sight of something that made her pause. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat a small daguerreotype in a simple frame, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Holding a small child, the woman bore no resemblance to Clara, but the picture had the look of something precious, carefully tended. Jonas noticed her gaze, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My wife," he said simply. "She's been gone 3 years now. I'm sorry for your loss," Clara said softly. He nodded once, curtly, and turned away. "There's a room upstairs you can use. I'll bring up some wood for the stove." As Jonas disappeared upstairs with an armload of firewood, Clara stood alone in the main room, listening to the storm rage outside. She poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. The house felt heavy with silence and secrets, but it was shelter. And for now, that was enough. From somewhere in the depths of the house came a sound that made Clara's blood turn cold, a child's voice, so soft it was barely audible above the wind, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. But the tone was unmistakable, fear, pure and desperate, threading through the darkness like a prayer no one was meant to hear. Clara set down her coffee cup, the ceramic making a soft clink against the wooden table that seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. The whisper had come from somewhere deeper in the house, so faint she might have imagined it if not for the way it had made her skin crawl with an inexplicable dread. Jonas's footsteps echoed from upstairs as he moved about preparing her room. Clara found herself drawn toward the back of the house, following a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet despite her attempts to walk quietly. At the end of the hall, one door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. She approached slowly, her heart beating faster with each step. Through the crack in the door, she could make out the faint outline of a small room, a child's bedroom. She realized, noting the low bed and what appeared to be a collection of wooden toys scattered across the floor. "Hello?" Clara called softly, pushing the door open just wide enough to peer inside. At first, she saw nothing but shadows and the dim glow of light filtering in from the hallway. Then, in the far corner, something moved. A small figure huddled against the wall, so still and quiet that Clara had almost missed her entirely. It was a little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with tangled auburn hair that hung in matted strands around her thin face. She wore a simple dress that had once been white, but was now gray with wear and what looked like years of insufficient washing. Her feet were bare despite the cold that seeped through the house, and her arms were wrapped tightly around her knees as she sat curled in the corner like a wounded animal seeking the darkest place to hide. But it was the child's eyes that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. They were enormous in her gaunt face, dark brown, and filled with an ancient sadness that no child should ever possess. They fixed on Clara with an intensity that was both piercing and empty, as if the girl was looking through her to something far more terrible. "Hello, sweetheart," Clara said gently, crouching down to make herself less imposing. "I'm Clara. What's your name?" The child said nothing, but her grip on her knees tightened until her knuckles went white. Clara noticed how thin the girl's arms were, how her collarbone stood out sharply beneath the worn fabric of her dress. When had she last had a proper meal? "I'm staying here tonight because of the storm," Clara continued, keeping her voice soft and non-threatening. "Are you Mr. McGraw's daughter?" Still no response, but the girl's eyes flickered slightly, as if she understood but couldn't or wouldn't answer. Clara took a small step closer, her heart aching at the sight of this clearly neglected child. "Are you cold, dear? Would you like me to bring you a blanket?" The girl's lips parted as if she might speak, then closed again. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. "Are you hungry?" Clara tried again. Another tiny shake of the head, though Clara could see the lie in it. The child was clearly malnourished, her cheeks hollow and her wrists so thin they looked as though they might snap. Clara settled onto the floor a few feet away from the girl, making herself comfortable despite the cold seeping up through the wooden boards. "You know, I've been traveling for a very long time, and I'm quite tired. Would you mind if I sat here with you for a while? Sometimes it's nice to have company when there's a storm outside." For the first time, the girl's expression shifted slightly. The rigid fear in her posture relaxed just a fraction, though she remained pressed against the wall. They sat in silence for several minutes, Clara patient and still while the child studied her with those haunting eyes. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the windows and making the old house creak and groan. The sound of Jonas's footsteps had ceased from upstairs, leaving them alone in their quiet vigil. Finally, the girl's lips moved. At first, no sound emerged, as if she'd forgotten how to use her voice. Then, barely audible above the storm, came a whisper so soft Clara had to lean forward to catch it. "Don't let him take Mama again!" The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What did you say, sweetheart?" The girl's eyes widened with what looked like surprise, as if she hadn't meant to speak at all. Her small hand flew to cover her mouth, and she shrank further back against the wall. "It's all right," Clara said quickly, her mind racing. "You don't have to be afraid. What do you mean about Mama?" But the girl had retreated back into silence, shaking her head frantically now, her eyes darting toward the doorway as if expecting someone to appear there. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Jonas's tall frame filled the doorway. His gray eyes took in the scene. Clara sitting on the floor, the child pressed against the wall, and his expression grew even more shuttered than before. "Lydia," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing out of bed?" So the child's name was Lydia. Clara filed this information away as she watched the interaction between father and daughter. There was no warmth in Jonas's tone, but no anger either. It was as if he was speaking to a stranger rather than his own child. Lydia's gaze flicked between Clara and her father, her small body trembling now. Clara could see the conflict in the girl's face, the desperate want to speak warring with some deeper terror. "She was just sitting here," Clara said gently, rising to her feet. "I think the storm might have frightened her." Jonas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lydia doesn't talk." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Clara looked down at the little girl, who was now staring at the floor as if it held the answers to all of life's mysteries. "She hasn't spoken since—" Jonas paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Since her mother died." Clara felt her heart clench. A mute child, traumatized by the loss of her mother. No wonder the girl seemed so lost and afraid. But Clara knew what she'd heard. Lydia had spoken, had whispered those terrible words about someone taking her mama. "How long has it been?" Clara asked softly. 3 years. Jonas stepped into the room, and Lydia immediately curled smaller, as if trying to disappear entirely. "Come on, Lydia, back to bed." But as Jonas reached down toward his daughter, Lydia's head snapped up, and she looked directly at Clara. Her mouth opened, and in a voice like rustling leaves, she whispered again, "Don't let him take Mama like he took her." The effect on Jonas was immediate and devastating. All color drained from his face, and he stumbled backward as if he'd been struck. His eyes went wide with what Clara could only describe as horror, and his hands began to shake. "What did she say?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara looked between father and daughter, her mind reeling. Lydia had spoken. There was no denying it now. But the words themselves, and Jonas's reaction to them, suggested something far more complex and disturbing than simple grief. Clara began, then stopped. The terror in Lydia's eyes, the shock in Jonas's, the way the very air in the room seemed to thicken with unspoken secrets. It all pointed to something dark lurking in this house's past. "She spoke," Clara said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her thoughts. "She's been speaking to me." Jonas sank down onto Lydia's small bed, his head in his hands. "That's impossible. She hasn't said a word since the night Elizabeth—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Lydia was watching her father now with those two knowing eyes, and Clara could see the child's internal struggle. Part of her wanted to speak again, to tell whatever truth she'd been carrying alone for 3 years. But another part, the part that had kept her silent all this time, held her back. Clara knelt down beside Lydia, ignoring Jonas for the moment. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "what happened to your mama?" Lydia's gaze flicked to her father, then back to Clara. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, more certain, though still barely above a whisper. "The bad man came in the dark. He made Papa drink the burning water, and then he took Mama to the cold place where she couldn't come back." Jonas's head shot up, his face a mask of anguish and confusion. "Lydia, what bad man? What are you talking about?" But Lydia had gone silent again, shrinking back against the wall as if her burst of speech had cost her everything. Clara could see the exhaustion in the child's face, the way speaking had drained what little strength she possessed. "That's enough for tonight," Clara said firmly, rising to her feet. She looked at Jonas, whose gray eyes were filled with a pain so deep it made her chest ache. "She's frightened and tired. We should let her rest." Jonas nodded numbly, seeming incapable of coherent thought. As Clara moved toward the door, she felt a small hand catch her skirt. She looked down to find Lydia gazing up at her with desperate intensity. "Don't go away," the child whispered. "Please don't go away like Mama did." Clara's heart broke completely. She knelt down and very gently touched Lydia's thin shoulder. I'm not going anywhere tonight, sweetheart. I'll be right upstairs if you need me. Lydia nodded solemnly, then released Clara's skirt and curled back up in her corner. Clara pulled a threadbare quilt from the bed and draped it carefully around the child's shoulders before following Jonas out of the room. In the hallway, Jonas leaned heavily against the wall, his face buried in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and haunted. "I don't understand," he said hoarsely. "She hasn't spoken a word in 3 years. The doctor said the shock of losing Elizabeth might have damaged her mind permanently." Clara studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. All she saw was a man drowning in grief and confusion, grappling with a daughter who had just shattered everything he thought he knew about that terrible night. "Children often know more than adults realize," she said carefully. "Sometimes they see things we miss." Jonas's laugh was bitter and broken. What could she have seen? She was only 3 when Elizabeth died, just a baby, old enough to remember. Clara replied, "Old enough to be afraid." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Lydia's words hanging between them like a specter. Finally, Jonas straightened, some of his earlier composure returning. "Your room is ready," he said, his tone once again carefully neutral. "I put extra wood by the stove." Clara nodded, recognizing the dismissal, but as she turned toward the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple case of mistaken directions. Whatever had happened to Elizabeth McGraw 3 years ago, it had left scars on this family that went far deeper than grief. And now, somehow, she was caught in the middle of it all. Clara's assigned room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a narrow hallway that creaked with every step. The space was simple but clean. A single bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a chipped ceramic pitcher, and a small wood-burning stove that Jonas had already stoked to chase away the bitter cold. A single window looked out onto the storm, where snow continued to fall in thick, relentless curtains. Despite her exhaustion from 3 days of travel, sleep eluded Clara entirely. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Lydia's whispered words, "Don't let him take Mama again." The child's voice had carried such conviction, such specific terror, that Clara couldn't dismiss it as the rambling of a traumatized mind. She rose before dawn, dressing quietly in the gray light that filtered through the frost-covered window. The storm had finally begun to weaken, though snow still fell steadily. From downstairs came the sound of someone moving about, the soft thud of wood being added to the fire, the clink of metal against metal as coffee was prepared. When Clara descended the stairs, she found Jonas standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the white expanse beyond. He'd already dressed for the day in wool trousers and a heavy flannel shirt, his dark hair still damp from washing. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and she was struck again by the weariness in his gray eyes. "Storm's breaking," he said without preamble. "Roads might be passable by afternoon." Clara nodded, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. The implication was clear. As soon as travel was feasible, she would continue to the Carter Ranch. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. McGraw." Jonas grunted in acknowledgement, returning his gaze to the window. "Carter's a good man. You'll be well cared for." There was something in his tone, a careful neutrality that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Clara studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped his coffee cup as if it were an anchor. "May I ask about your wife?" she said gently. "How did she die?" Jonas's entire body went rigid. For a long moment, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. "Accident, winter of '67. She went out during a blizzard and never came back. Found her body 3 days later in the ravine near Willow Creek." The words were delivered like a recitation, as if he'd repeated them so many times they'd lost all meaning. But Clara caught the slight tremor in his voice on the word body, the way his knuckles whitened around the coffee cup. "That must have been terrible for you and Lydia," Clara said softly. Jonas's laugh was harsh and bitter. Lydia doesn't remember much. She was just a baby. Better that way. But Clara remembered the terror in the little girl's eyes, the way she'd spoken about the bad man and the cold place. That wasn't the vague confusion of infant memory. It was the specific fear of someone who had witnessed something traumatic. She seems to remember more than you might think, Clara observed carefully. Jonas set down his coffee cup with enough force to make it rattle against the saucer. Lydia's mind was damaged by what happened. The doctor in town said children that young can't properly process such trauma. Whatever she thinks she remembers, it's not real. There was a desperate edge to his words that made Clara wonder if he was trying to convince her or himself. Before she could respond, a soft sound from the doorway made them both turn. Lydia stood at the entrance to the kitchen, still wearing her wrinkled dress from the night before. Her auburn hair hung in tangled knots around her thin face, and her feet were bare against the cold wooden floor. She looked between Clara and her father with those enormous dark eyes, then slowly approached Clara's side, without a word. Lydia reached out and took Clara's hand. Her small fingers were ice cold and trembled slightly, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She tugged gently, as if wanting Clara to follow her. "What is it, sweetheart?" Clara asked, allowing herself to be led. Lydia glanced nervously at her father, then looked up at Clara with unmistakable intent. She wanted to show Clara something, but not with Jonas present. Jonas had noticed the exchange. His expression darkened as he watched his daughter cling to this stranger. "Lydia, come eat your breakfast." But Lydia shook her head, her grip on Clara's hand tightening. She pulled more insistently, leading Clara toward a door that Clara hadn't noticed the night before. It was partially hidden behind a tall cabinet, the wood darker than the rest of the house, as if it had been added later. "Where does that lead?" Clara asked. Jonas's face had gone pale. "Nowhere important, just storage." But Lydia was already pulling Clara forward, and despite Jonas's obvious reluctance, Clara allowed herself to be guided. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that led up to what must have been an attic space. Weak morning light filtered down from above, and Clara could smell the musty scent of old wood and stored belongings. "Lydia, no!" Jonas said sharply, his voice carrying a note of panic. "You don't need to go up there." But Lydia was already climbing the stairs with the determined purpose of a child on a mission. Clara followed, Jonas's heavy footsteps reluctantly bringing up the rear. The attic was larger than Clara had expected, running the full length of the house. Wooden crates and barrels were stacked along the walls, and old furniture draped in white sheets created ghostly shapes in the dim light. But it was what occupied the center of the space that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. A collection of women's belongings lay carefully arranged on a large trunk as if they were sacred relics. Dresses in faded blues and greens, their fabric still beautiful despite the years. A silver hairbrush with intricate engravings on the handle. A pair of delicate leather boots, small enough to belong to a woman of petite stature. And in the center of it all, a daguerreotype in an ornate silver frame. The same woman from the portrait downstairs. But this image showed her in a wedding dress, radiant with happiness and hope. "Elizabeth's things," Jonas said quietly from behind them, his voice thick with emotion. Lydia led Clara closer to the trunk, then pointed to a leather-bound book that lay open beside the photograph. Clara leaned down to look and saw it was a Bible, its pages yellowed with age. On the inside cover, written in elegant script, were the words, "Elizabeth Rose Patterson, beloved wife of Jonas McGraw, married June 15th, 1862. But it was what Lydia did next that sent chills down Clara's spine. The little girl reached beneath the Bible and pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn as if it had been handled many times. She pressed it into Clara's hand, her dark eyes wide with urgency. "Lydia, put that back," Jonas said sharply, moving forward. But Clara had already unfolded the paper. It was a letter, written in the same elegant handwriting as the Bible inscription. The date at the top read March 10th, 1867, just weeks before Elizabeth's death. "My dearest sister Margaret, The letter began. I write to you in great distress, for I fear my situation here has become dangerous. The man Jonas hired last autumn, Harlan Danner, has become increasingly bold in his attentions toward me. When I reject his advances, he grows angry and threatening. Yesterday he cornered me in the barn and said terrible things about what he would do if I continued to play the untouchable lady. I am frightened, Margaret, but Jonas trusts Harlan and refuses to see the threat he poses. The man drinks heavily and has a violent temper that seems to worsen with each passing day. I fear what might happen if... The letter ended abruptly, as if Elizabeth had been interrupted while writing. Clara's hands shook as she read the words again, their implication becoming terrifyingly clear. "Where did you get this?" she whispered to Lydia. The little girl pointed to a small gap between the floorboards where the letter had apparently been hidden. Then she tugged on Clara's skirt and whispered so softly that Clara had to lean down to hear. "Mama was scared of the bad man. She told me to hide when he came." Jonas had gone completely white. He stared at the letter in Clara's hands as if it were a venomous snake. I never knew she... Elizabeth never said anything about, but his voice trailed off as the implication sank in. Clara watched his face transform as memory and realization collided. His gray eyes widened with growing horror as pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed began falling into place. "Harlan Danner," he whispered. "He was here that night. He brought the whiskey, said we should drink to Elizabeth's memory since it was the anniversary of when we first met. I remember drinking, but after that..." He pressed his hands to his temples. "I can't remember anything after that." Lydia had been watching her father's face with the intensity of someone who had waited years for this moment of understanding. When she spoke again, her voice was clearer than Clara had yet heard it. "The bad man put the burning water in Papa's cup. Then he took Mama outside and she never came back. I saw from the window." The silence that followed was deafening. Jonas sank down onto a crate as if his legs would no longer support him. His face was a mask of anguish and dawning comprehension. "He drugged me," Jonas said hoarsely. "God help me. He drugged me and then he..." He couldn't finish the sentence, but Clara could see the terrible understanding in his eyes. For 3 years, he'd believed himself somehow responsible for his wife's death, had tortured himself with guilt and half-remembered nightmares. Now he was learning that his worst fears might be true, but in a way he'd never imagined. Clara knelt beside Lydia, her heart breaking for this brave little girl who had carried such a terrible secret for so long. "Why didn't you tell anyone before now, sweetheart?" Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "The bad man said if I told, he would come back and take me to the cold place too. He said no one would believe a baby anyway." The calculated cruelty of it took Clara's breath away. To threaten a 3-year-old child, to silence her with terror and then let her father suffer with guilt for years. It spoke of a mind capable of true evil. Jonas looked up at his daughter with an expression of absolute devastation. "Lydia, I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have protected you both." But Lydia surprised them all. Instead of shrinking away from her father as she had done before, she approached him slowly and placed her small hand on his knee. "It wasn't your fault, Papa," she said in her whisper-soft voice. "Mama told me before the bad man came. She said you were good and the bad man was trying to trick you." Jonas pulled his daughter into his arms for the first time in Clara's presence, and she could see the tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. For a moment, the ghosts in the attic seemed to settle, as if Elizabeth's spirit could finally rest knowing the truth had been revealed. But Clara's mind was already racing ahead to more immediate concerns. If Harlan Danner had murdered Elizabeth and threatened Lydia into silence, where was he now? And what would happen when he learned that the little girl had finally broken her terrified silence, as if summoned by her thoughts? The sound of a horse's hooves echoed from outside, audible even over the diminishing storm. All 3 of them froze, and Clara saw the terror return to Lydia's eyes as she pressed closer to her father. "He's coming back," the little girl whispered. "The bad man is coming back." The sound of hooves proved to be a false alarm. merely a neighbor's horse that had broken free during the storm and was now wandering lost through the snow. But the terror in Lydia's eyes at the sound had shaken Clara to her core. The child's fear was real and immediate, suggesting that Harlan Danner was not just a figure from the past, but a continuing threat. Jonas spent the rest of the morning in a state of stunned silence, moving through his daily chores like a man walking through a nightmare. Clara watched him tend to the animals and repair a section of fence damaged by the storm, his movements mechanical and distant. The revelation that his wife had been murdered, and that he had been drugged and manipulated into believing himself somehow responsible, had shattered something fundamental in him. Lydia, meanwhile, had not left Clara's side since their discovery in the attic. She followed Clara from room to room with the desperate attachment of someone who had finally found a lifeline after years of drowning in silence. When Clara helped her wash and braid her tangled hair, the little girl sat perfectly still, as if afraid that any movement might break the spell of kindness. "Tell me about the night your mama died," Clara said gently as she worked the knots from Lydia's auburn locks. "What exactly did you see?" Lydia was quiet for so long that Clara thought she might have retreated back into silence. Then, in her whisper-soft voice, she began to speak. "Mama was scared for many days before. She kept looking out the windows and jumping when doors opened. She wrote letters but burned them instead of sending them. The night it happened, she made me promise to hide in the cupboard if the bad man came, no matter what I heard." Clara's hand stilled in the child's hair. "She knew something was going to happen?" Lydia nodded solemnly. "She said the bad man was getting angry because she wouldn't be nice to him when Papa wasn't watching. She said he might try to hurt us." The picture that emerged was chilling. Elizabeth McGraw had been living in fear, trapped in her own home by a man who grew bolder and more threatening each day. And when she'd tried to seek help or protection, no one had listened. "What happened that night?" Clara asked. Lydia's small body tensed, but she continued. "The bad man came after Papa went to bed. He knocked on the door and said he had something important to tell Mama about the cattle. When she let him in, he had a bottle with him. He made Papa drink from it. Said they were celebrating something. Papa got sleepy real fast, like when he had the fever last winter." Clara felt sick imagining it. Jonas drugged into unconsciousness while his wife faced her tormentor alone. "Then what happened?" "Mama tried to wake Papa up, but she couldn't. The bad man laughed and said Papa wouldn't wake up until morning. Then he put his hands on Mama and said she couldn't say no anymore." Lydia's voice dropped to barely audible. "Mama screamed and tried to run, but he caught her. He said they were going outside to talk where Papa couldn't hear them." Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, but she forced herself to remain calm for Lydia's sake. "Did you see them leave?" "I watched from the window upstairs. He was pulling Mama by her arm, and she was trying to get away. They went toward the creek. I waited and waited, but only the bad man came back. He came inside and moved Papa to his bed. Then he took some of Mama's things and threw them in the fire. Before he left, he looked right at where I was hiding and said if I ever told anyone what I saw, he would come back and take me to the same cold place where Mama was." The calculated nature of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. Harlan Danner had not acted in passion or desperation. He had planned Elizabeth's murder, executed it with cold precision, and then terrorized a 3-year-old child into silence to cover his tracks. "Has he come back since then?" Clara asked. Lydia nodded, her small body trembling. "Sometimes. He comes to talk to Papa about work or buying cattle. He always smiles at me when Papa isn't looking. And sometimes he whispers that he's glad I'm such a good, quiet girl." Clara's blood ran cold. The monster had been returning to the scene of his crime, probably enjoying the power he held over both Jonas and Lydia. Jonas racked with guilt and believing himself somehow responsible for his wife's death. And Lydia, too terrified to speak the truth that could free them both. "Lydia," Clara said carefully, "do you know where this man lives now?" "He has a cabin about an hour's ride north, near where the river bends. Papa says he moved there after Mama died because he felt bad about what happened. But I know he moved there because it's closer to the cold place where he put Mama." Clara's mind was racing. If Harlan Danner lived so close, he would certainly know about the storm and might even have seen the smoke from Jonas's chimney. He might already know that a stranger was staying at the McGraw Ranch, a stranger who could potentially upset the delicate balance of fear and guilt that had kept his crime hidden for 3 years. As if summoned by her thoughts, Jonas appeared in the doorway. His face was haggard, aged years in the span of a single morning. "Roads are clearing," he said flatly. "You could probably make it to Carter's ranch by mid-afternoon." Clara looked down at Lydia, who had gone rigid with fear at the mention of her leaving. The child's small hand clutched at Clara's skirt with desperate intensity. "Don't go," Lydia whispered, so softly that Jonas couldn't hear. "Please don't leave me alone with the bad man." Clara's heart clenched. How could she abandon this child now, knowing what she knew? But what choice did she have? She was expected at the Carter Ranch, where a man waited to marry her. Her entire future depended on that arrangement. "Mr. McGraw," Clara said carefully. "Given what we've learned today, don't you think it might be wise to contact the sheriff? If Harlan Danner is responsible for your wife's death," Jonas's laugh was bitter and hollow, "Sheriff Hawkins is Harlan's cousin. Even if I could prove what happened, which I can't, do you think he'd take the word of a traumatized child over his own family?" Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana cold. Surely there must be someone else, a federal marshal, perhaps, or Miss Whitmore. Jonas interrupted, his voice heavy with resignation. "You've been kind to Lydia, and I'm grateful for that, but this is our burden to bear. You have your own life to live." But Clara found she couldn't simply walk away. Looking into Lydia's frightened eyes, she saw herself at that age, vulnerable, alone, desperate for someone to care enough to fight for her. Her own childhood had been marked by loss and abandonment, and she recognized the same hollow desperation in this little girl. "What if there was another way?" Clara said slowly. "What if we could find proof of what really happened?" Jonas stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "It's been 3 years. What proof could possibly remain?" Clara thought of Elizabeth's letter, hidden in the attic floorboards. Your wife was intelligent and observant. If she suspected Harlan was dangerous, she might have documented other incidents. And if he's continued to visit here regularly, he might have grown careless, left evidence behind. "It's too dangerous," Jonas said flatly. If Harlan suspected we knew the truth, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood what a man capable of murder might do to protect himself. That afternoon, as Clara prepared to leave for the Carter Ranch, she was surprised by a visitor. An elderly woman in a worn brown coat appeared at the door, introducing herself as Mrs. Henrietta Hensley from the neighboring property. She was thin and sharp-eyed, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and a manner that suggested she missed very little of what went on around her. "Heard there was a stranger staying here during the storm," Mrs. Hensley said without preamble, studying Clara with frank curiosity. "Wanted to make sure everything was all right." Jonas's jaw tightened. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Hensley. Miss Whitmore was just leaving." But Mrs. Hensley seemed in no hurry to be dismissed. Her keen eyes took in Lydia hovering close to Clara's side, the tension radiating from Jonas, and Clara's obvious reluctance to leave. "You know," the older woman said conversationally, "I've been meaning to stop by for months now, ever since I heard Harlan Danner was back in the area." The effect of her words was immediate. Jonas went pale, and Lydia pressed closer to Clara. Mrs. Hensley noted their reactions with the sharp attention of someone who had been waiting years for confirmation of her suspicions. "He's been gone?" Clara asked carefully. "Oh yes, dear. Left right after poor Elizabeth's funeral. Said he couldn't bear to stay in a place with so many sad memories. Spent the last year working ranches down in Colorado Territory. Just came back last month, claiming he missed the Montana country." Clara felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "Do you know why he came back?" Mrs. Hensley's eyes glittered with something that might have been satisfaction. "Well, that's the interesting thing. Word is he's been asking questions around town about the McGraw place." wondering if Jonas might be looking to sell, if there were any strangers coming around, that sort of thing. The implications were chilling. If Harlan had returned specifically to monitor the McGraw ranch, it suggested he was concerned about something, perhaps worried that his crime might eventually be discovered. "Mrs. Hensley," Clara said carefully. "What did you think about Elizabeth's death?" The older woman's expression grew grim. "I thought it was mighty strange. If you want the truth, Elizabeth McGraw was no fool, and she knew this country like the back of her hand. For her to get lost in a storm and fall into that ravine, it never sat right with me." Jonas was staring at Mrs. Hensley as if seeing her for the first time. "You had suspicions?" "Suspicions," Mrs. Hensley snorted. "I had more than suspicions. I heard screaming that night, coming from the direction of Willow Creek. Heard it clear as a bell, even over the wind. When I mentioned it to Sheriff Hawkins, he said it was probably just a wildcat or some such nonsense." Clara's pulse quickened. "You heard screaming?" "A woman's voice, no doubt about it, crying for help." Mrs. Hensley's face was hard as granite. "I've regretted not investigating that night for 3 years running. If I'd gone to look instead of assuming someone else would handle it." The guilt in her voice was palpable, and Clara realized that Mrs. Hensley had been carrying her own burden of regret all this time. "There's something else," the older woman continued. "The day they found Elizabeth's body, I saw Harlan Danner riding away from the creek area real early in the morning. When I asked him later what he'd been doing there, he said he'd been helping with the search, but the search party didn't start looking until hours after I saw him." Clara exchanged a meaningful look with Jonas. Here, finally, was an adult witness who could corroborate at least part of Lydia's story. "Mrs. Hensley," Clara said carefully, "if there was a way to prove what really happened to Elizabeth, would you be willing to testify to what you saw and heard?" The older woman's eyes hardened with resolve. "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask me that question. Dear, yes, I would testify. That poor woman deserves justice, and this family deserves the truth." As Mrs. Hensley prepared to leave, she turned back to Clara with a warning in her eyes. "Be careful, dear. If Harlan Danner is involved in Elizabeth's death like I suspect, he won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens to expose him, and he'll be especially dangerous if he feels cornered." After she left, Clara stood in the doorway, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. She should be leaving for the Carter Ranch now, should be riding toward the future she had planned. But Lydia's small hand in hers and the weight of the truth they had uncovered made that future feel suddenly impossible. Sometimes, Clara realized, fate didn't take you where you planned to go. Sometimes it took you exactly where you needed to be. As evening approached, another storm began to gather on the horizon, its dark clouds promising a repeat of the previous night's fury. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the wind bend the bare trees and knowing that her journey to the Carter Ranch would have to wait another day. Part of her felt guilty for the relief that flooded through her at this reprieve, but a larger part recognized it as providence. Jonas had been splitting wood behind the house since Mrs. Hensley's departure, attacking the logs with a violence that spoke of his inner turmoil. Clara could see him through the window, his movements sharp and angry as he worked to exhaust the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. The rhythmic thunk of the axe against wood had become the soundtrack to the dying day. Lydia sat at the kitchen table, carefully drawing with a piece of charcoal on brown paper. Clara had found the supplies in a drawer and encouraged the artistic outlet, hoping it might help the child process some of her stored trauma. But when Clara looked at what Lydia was creating, her blood chilled. The drawing showed a small house with smoke rising from the chimney, clearly the McGraw Ranch. But surrounding the house were dark figures with reaching hands, and in the corner, barely visible but unmistakably present, was the shape of a man watching from the trees. Lydia had drawn him again and again in different positions around the house, as if he were circling like a predator. "Sweetheart," Clara said gently, sitting beside the child. "Is this how you feel? Like someone is watching the house?" Lydia nodded solemnly. her small hand moving the charcoal across the paper to darken the watching figure. "He comes sometimes at night. I see him from my window. He just stands there looking at the house." Clara's skin crawled with the implications. Harlan Danner had been stalking this family for 3 years, maintaining his psychological control through fear and surveillance. The man was not just a killer. He was a tormentor who fed on the suffering he had created. When Jonas finally came inside, his face was flushed from cold and exertion, his dark hair damp with sweat despite the freezing temperature. He moved to the wash basin without speaking, his movement still carrying that edge of barely controlled rage. "Another storm coming," he said curtly, not meeting Clara's eyes. "You'll have to stay another night." Clara heard both apology and something else in his voice, perhaps a reluctant gratitude that she wouldn't be leaving them alone tonight. The knowledge of Harlan's nighttime surveillance had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. "I don't mind," Clara said simply. "In fact, I've been thinking it might be better if I stayed a few more days, until we can figure out what to do about the situation." Jonas's hand stilled on the towel he was using to dry his face. "That's not your responsibility." "Maybe not," Clara agreed. "But it's what I want to do." Their eyes met across the kitchen, and Clara saw something shift in Jonas's expression. The careful distance he had maintained since her arrival began to crack, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the protective shell he had built around his heart. As the wind began to howl outside and the first snow of the new storm started to fall, Clara prepared a simple supper from the supplies in Jonas's larder. She had noticed that both he and Lydia were too thin, their meals clearly consisting of whatever was easiest rather than what was nourishing. The house had the feel of a place where people existed rather than lived. While she worked, Lydia stayed close by her side, occasionally handing her ingredients or stirring the pot when asked. The child moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be useful without getting in the way, another heartbreaking sign of the emotional neglect she had endured. Jonas sat at the table watching them, and Clara could feel his eyes on her as she moved around his kitchen with growing familiarity. There was something almost hungry in his gaze, as if he were starving for the sight of normal domestic life that had been absent from his home for so long. When they finally sat down to eat, the storm outside had reached its full fury. The wind rattled the windows and sent snow whipping across the glass in hypnotic patterns. The sound was both beautiful and ominous, reminding them all of their isolation in this remote place. "Tell me about before," Clara said to Jonas as they ate. "What was your life like when Elizabeth was alive?" Jonas was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. It was different. The house was always warm, always full of music. Elizabeth sang while she worked, and Lydia would dance around the kitchen while her mother cooked. His voice grew soft with memory. Elizabeth had dreams of expanding the ranch, maybe getting some sheep to go with the cattle. She wanted to plant fruit trees and have a proper garden. She said this place could be paradise if we just put enough love into it. Clara could see the pain in his eyes as he remembered what had been lost. "She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was strong, intelligent, brave, maybe too brave for her own good." Jonas's jaw tightened. "If she had told me about Harlan's threats." "She was trying to protect you," Clara said gently. "And Lydia, she probably hoped she could handle it herself, or that he would lose interest and leave." Jonas's laugh was bitter. "Instead, she died for her silence, and I've been living with the guilt ever since. Some protector I turned out to be." Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough from years of ranch work, warm and solid beneath her palm. "You couldn't protect against a threat you didn't know existed. The guilt belongs to one man, Harlan Danner." Jonas stared down at their joined hands for a long moment. When he looked up, his gray eyes were filled with an emotion Clara couldn't quite identify. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "Why do you care what happens to us?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how much her answer might reveal. Because, she said slowly, I know what it's like to be alone and afraid. I know what it's like to feel like no one in the world cares whether you live or die. Jonas's eyes sharpened with interest. Tell me. Clara withdrew her hand from his, suddenly self-conscious. She had not intended to reveal so much of herself, but something about this man and this situation stripped away her usual defenses. I was a field nurse during the war, she began hesitantly. I'd lost my parents to fever when I was 16, and nursing was the only respectable work I could find. For 3 years, I patched up soldiers and watched too many of them die. I thought I was doing important work, helping to save lives. She paused, gathering courage for the hardest part of her story. Then came the Battle of Cedar Creek. Our field hospital was overrun by Confederate forces. There was shelling, chaos, people screaming and running everywhere. A piece of shrapnel. She touched her abdomen unconsciously. The doctors saved my life, but they couldn't save my ability to bear children. Jonas's expression grew very still, his eyes never leaving her face. When I recovered, I was discharged from service. No one wanted a barren nurse when there were whole women available. I spent 2 years taking whatever work I could find, laundry, sewing, cleaning. But everywhere I went, people looked at me with pity or suspicion. A woman alone, damaged, with no family to vouch for her character. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. I answered Mr. Carter's advertisement because I was tired of being alone, tired of being seen as incomplete. I thought if I could just find someone who needed a wife for practical reasons rather than other purposes, I might finally have a place where I belonged. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm raging outside. Clara could feel her heart pounding as she waited for Jonas's reaction. Would he look at her with the same pity she had endured from so many others? Would he see her as broken, less than a complete woman? Instead, Jonas reached across the table and took her hand again, his grip firm and warm. You're not damaged, he said with quiet intensity. You're the strongest woman I've ever met. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple acceptance in his voice. How can you say that? I can't even fulfill the most basic function expected of a wife. Elizabeth couldn't have children either, Jonas said softly, causing Clara to look up in surprise. She had 2 miscarriages before Lydia, and the doctors said the difficult birth damaged her too badly for more pregnancies. But that never made her less of a woman or less of a wife. It just made her love Lydia even more fiercely. Clara stared at him, processing this revelation. But Lydia was born to Elizabeth's younger sister, who died in childbirth. Elizabeth and I adopted her as our own when she was just hours old. The only mother Lydia has ever known was the woman who chose to love her, not the one who bore her. The parallels were breathtaking. Here was a man who had already learned that family was made by choice and love rather than blood. A man who understood that a woman's worth was not determined by her fertility. That's why you've been so patient with her trauma, Clara realized. Because you know what it's like to build a family from love rather than obligation. Jonas nodded, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of Clara's hand. Love isn't about what you can give. It's about choosing to give what you have. The intimacy of the moment was broken by a small voice from across the table. Are you going to be my new mama? Both adults turned to look at Lydia, who had been listening to their conversation with the intense focus children brought to adult mysteries. Her dark eyes moved between Clara and her father with hopeful uncertainty. Lydia, Jonas said carefully, Miss Clara has her own life planned. She's going to marry Mr. Carter and— But I don't want her to go, Lydia interrupted, her voice rising with the beginning of panic. She makes Papa smile, and she makes the house warm. Please don't go away like Mama did. Clara felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. This child, who had been silent for 3 years, was finally finding her voice again, and she was using it to ask Clara to stay. Sweetheart, Clara said gently, I'm not going anywhere tonight. The storm won't let me. But Lydia was too smart to be satisfied with temporary reassurance. What about when the storm stops? Clara looked across the table at Jonas, seeing her own conflicted emotions reflected in his gray eyes. The practical part of her mind insisted that she had commitments to honor, a future already arranged. But her heart was already writing a different story, one where she stayed in this house and helped heal the wounds that Harlan Danner had inflicted on this family. "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "But I promise I won't leave without saying goodbye." It wasn't the answer Lydia wanted, but it was all Clara could give. As they prepared for bed that night, with the storm raging outside and the future uncertain, Clara found herself caught between two possible lives: the safe, predictable marriage she had planned, and the dangerous, complicated love that was growing in her heart like a flame in the darkness. The second storm passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the morning sun. Clara woke to the sound of Lydia's quiet breathing beside her. The child had crept into her room sometime during the darkest hours, seeking comfort from nightmares that Clara could only imagine. Downstairs, Jonas was already moving about, preparing coffee and stoking the fire. Clara could hear the measured cadence of his movements, but beneath the routine, she sensed a tension that hadn't been there the day before. When she descended the stairs with Lydia's small hand clasped in hers, she found Jonas standing at the window, his body rigid with alertness. "What is it?" Clara asked softly. Jonas didn't turn from the window. "Tracks in the snow. Someone was here during the night, circling the house." Clara felt ice form in her veins. She moved to the window and peered out at the pristine white expanse surrounding the house. There, clear as writing on paper, were the prints of a horse and rider that formed a complete circuit around the McGraw property. The tracks came close enough to the windows that whoever had made them could have looked inside, could have seen Clara moving about the house, could have watched them sitting together by the fire the night before. "He knows I'm here," Clara said quietly, the realization settling over her like a shroud. Lydia pressed closer to Clara's side, her small body trembling with remembered terror. "The bad man came back," she whispered. "He always comes back." Jonas finally turned from the window, his gray eyes hard as granite. "Pack your things. I'm taking you to the Carter Ranch today, as soon as the horses are ready." "No," Clara said, the word emerging with surprising firmness. "I'm not leaving." Jonas stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "You don't understand. If Harlan knows you're here, if he suspects you know the truth about Elizabeth, you're in danger, real danger." Clara lifted her chin with determination she hadn't known she possessed. "Then we face that danger together. I won't abandon Lydia to face this alone again." "This isn't your fight," Jonas said through gritted teeth. "It became my fight the moment that child trusted me with the truth," Clara replied firmly. "Besides, if I disappear now, right after learning about Elizabeth's murder, don't you think that might make Harlan even more suspicious? At least if I'm here, we can control the situation." Before Jonas could respond, the sound of an approaching horse cut through the morning air. All three of them froze, then moved instinctively toward the window. In the distance, a single rider was approaching at a leisurely pace, as if he had all the time in the world. Lydia's reaction was immediate and visceral. She dove under the kitchen table, pressing herself into the smallest possible space while her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. The terror radiating from the child left no doubt about the identity of their visitor. "Stay calm," Jonas murmured to Clara, though she could see the tension coiled in every line of his body. "Let me do the talking." The rider came into clear view as he approached the house. A tall man in his 30s with sandy brown hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his pale blue eyes. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being in control, and when he smiled as he dismounted, the expression never reached his eyes. Harlan Danner had come calling. Jonas opened the door before the man could knock, stepping out onto the porch and pulling the door closed behind him. Clara pressed herself against the wall beside the window, straining to hear their conversation while keeping one eye on Lydia. who remained hidden beneath the table. "Morning, Jonas." Harlan's voice carried easily on the cold air, jovial and friendly. "Saw smoke from your chimney these past couple days. Figured I'd ride over and make sure you and the little one weathered the storms all right." "We're fine," Jonas replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Kind of you to check. Well, you know me, always looking out for my friends." There was a pause. Then Harlan's voice took on a note of casual curiosity. "Thought I saw an extra horse in your stable yesterday. You taking in strays now?" Clara's heart pounded as she realized how carefully Harlan had been watching the property. He knew exactly what was happening here. Probably knew her name and destination by now. "Traveler got caught in the storm," Jonas said evenly. "Gave them shelter for the night." "Them?" Harlan's voice sharpened with interest. Clara could practically feel Jonas's internal struggle, knowing he had to provide some explanation while revealing as little as possible. "Woman traveling to the Carter place. Mail-order bride who got lost in the weather." Harlan's laugh was low and unpleasant. "Well, I'll be... Old Elias finally found himself a replacement for poor Sarah. Did he? Where is this bride to be? I'd love to meet her." "Already left for Carter's." Jonas lied smoothly. "Headed out early this morning when the weather cleared." There was a long silence, and Clara could imagine Harlan processing this information, comparing it with whatever surveillance he had conducted during the night. "That's funny," Harlan said slowly, "because I could have sworn I saw lamplight in your upstairs windows well past dawn, and there's still 3 sets of footprints leading from your house to the barn this morning. You, the little one, and someone else." Clara's blood turned to ice. Harlan had been watching them far more closely than they'd realized, and Jonas's lie had just made their situation infinitely more dangerous. "Must be old tracks," Jonas said, but Clara could hear the strain in his voice. "In fresh snow that fell after midnight." Harlan's tone had turned silky with menace. "Come now. Jonas, we're old friends. No need for deception between us." Clara made a decision that would haunt her for years to come, before Jonas could dig himself deeper into the lie. She opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, Harlan's pale eyes fixed on her immediately, studying her with the intensity of a predator evaluating new prey. "I'm sorry," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I overslept and made Mr. McGraw late getting me on the road. I was just gathering my things." Harlan's smile was sharp as a blade. "Well, hello there, Miss Harlan Danner, at your service." He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "And you would be?" "Clara Whitmore," she replied, fighting the urge to step backward as his cold gaze traveled over her with insolent familiarity. "Miss Clara Whitmore," Harlan repeated, as if tasting her name. "Traveling all the way from... where was it? Missouri. That's quite a journey for a woman alone." Clara forced herself to smile. "A necessary one. Mr. Carter and I have been corresponding for several months." "Of course you have." Harlan's expression was knowing, calculating. "And how do you find our little corner of Montana territory? Quite different from civilized Missouri, I'd imagine." "The landscape is beautiful," Clara said carefully, "though I understand it can be dangerous for those who don't know the country well." Something flickered in Harlan's eyes at her words, a brief flash of something that might have been amusement or warning. "Oh, very dangerous indeed. Why, just 3 years ago, we lost a lovely young woman right here in this area. Poor Elizabeth McGraw, Jonas's dear departed wife, got lost in a blizzard and never found her way home." The casual cruelty with which he spoke of Elizabeth's death, standing just feet from her widowed husband, took Clara's breath away. But it was Jonas's reaction that truly frightened her. She could see him struggling to maintain control, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "A tragedy," Clara managed. "Indeed. Such a shame when bad things happen to good people." Harlan's smile widened. "Showing too many teeth. But I'm sure a smart woman like yourself will be careful to avoid such misfortunes." The threat was barely veiled, and Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana cold. This man was not just a killer. He was someone who took pleasure in psychological torture, who enjoyed the power that fear gave him over others. "I should be going," Clara said, taking a step toward the door. "Mr. Carter will be expecting me." "Oh, but there's no rush," Harlan said smoothly. "In fact, I was just thinking what a shame it would be if you left without meeting little Lydia. She's such a special child, very observant. Aren't you, sweetheart?" Clara's heart stopped as she realized Harlan was looking past her, through the open door to where Lydia stood in the hallway. The child had emerged from her hiding place, drawn by some compulsion Clara couldn't understand. Lydia's face was pale as parchment, her dark eyes wide with terror, but she stood frozen as if caught in a serpent's gaze. "There she is," Harlan said softly, his voice taking on a crooning quality that made Clara's skin crawl. "My favorite little girl, still so quiet and well-behaved." "I see. That's good. Lydia, very good." Clara stepped deliberately between Harlan and the child, breaking the line of sight. "Lydia, go back inside!" But Lydia seemed incapable of movement, trapped in some nightmare of memory and fear. It was Jonas who finally broke the spell, moving to stand beside Clara and creating a wall of protection between Harlan and his daughter. "Time for you to move along, Harlan," Jonas said, his voice low and dangerous. Harlan's expression shifted, the friendly mask slipping to reveal something cold and reptilian beneath. For a moment, Clara thought he might refuse to leave, might force a confrontation right here on the porch. Then the mask slid back into place, and he touched his hat brim again. Of course, wouldn't want to delay Miss Whitmore's journey to her new life. He mounted his horse with fluid grace, but before riding away, he leaned forward in the saddle and fixed Clara with those pale, merciless eyes. "Safe travels, Miss Whitmore, and remember, this country can be very unforgiving to those who lose their way." He rode off at the same leisurely pace with which he'd arrived, but Clara could feel his eyes on them until he disappeared over the rise. Only then did she realize she'd been holding her breath. Jonas immediately gathered Lydia into his arms, the child finally breaking down into silent sobs against his shoulder. Clara closed the door and leaned against it, her legs suddenly unsteady. "He knows," she said quietly. "He knows I heard something from Lydia, and he knows I'm not planning to leave quietly." Jonas's face was grim as he stroked his daughter's hair. "Then we're in trouble. Real trouble, because a man like Harlan Danner doesn't make threats he doesn't intend to keep." As if to emphasize his words, the sound of a rifle shot echoed across the valley, distant but unmistakable. It was followed by another, then another, in a measured pattern that seemed almost like a signal, or a promise. Clara looked out the window toward the direction Harlan had ridden, and saw a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. He had stopped somewhere within sight of the house and was making sure they knew he was still watching. The game had begun in earnest, and Clara realized with crystal clarity that only one side would survive it. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness, each moment stretched taut with the anticipation of violence. Jonas had barricaded the doors and positioned his rifle near the main window, while Clara kept Lydia close, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy even as dread settled over the house like a suffocating blanket. The distant smoke had continued to rise throughout the day, a constant reminder that Harlan was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jonas had suggested riding to town for help, but they all knew it was futile. Sheriff Hawkins would never act against his cousin based on the testimony of a traumatized child and a stranger. As evening approached, the temperature began to drop precipitously, and another storm gathered on the horizon. Clara found herself caught between hope and fear. The weather might provide cover if they needed to escape, but it would also isolate them further from any potential help. "He's going to come tonight?" Jonas said quietly as they watched the sun sink toward the mountains, under cover of the storm, when visibility is poor. Clara nodded, her hand resting protectively on Lydia's shoulder. The child had barely spoken since Harlan's visit, retreating into the defensive silence that had protected her for 3 years. But her dark eyes remained alert, tracking every sound and movement with the hypervigilance of prey. "What's his plan, do you think?" Clara asked. Jonas's jaw tightened. "Same as before. Probably. Make it look like an accident, maybe a fire during the storm, or people getting lost in the blizzard. He's good at making his crimes appear natural." The wind began to pick up as darkness fell, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling past the glass. Jonas lit only a single lamp, keeping the house as dark as possible while still allowing them to see. They gathered in the main room, where the rifle was within easy reach and they could monitor all approaches to the house. Clara had been thinking all day about Elizabeth's final letter, about the woman's desperate attempts to document the threat against her. If they didn't survive the night, would anyone ever know the truth? Would Harlan continue his reign of terror unchallenged? "Jonas," she said quietly, "if something happens to us, Mrs. Hensley will remember our conversation. She might investigate." "Might isn't enough," Jonas replied grimly. "Harlan's too smart to leave loose ends." As if summoned by their conversation, a new sound cut through the wind, the crack of breaking glass from somewhere upstairs. All three of them froze, listening intently. Then came the soft thud of footsteps above their heads. "He's in the house," Jonas whispered, reaching for his rifle. But before he could grasp it, the lamp suddenly went out, plunging them into complete darkness. A voice spoke from the stairway, cultured and calm despite the violence of his entry. Now, Jonas. No need for weapons between old friends." Clara felt Lydia press against her side, the child's small body trembling with terror. In the darkness, she could hear Jonas moving, trying to position himself between his family and the threat. "What do you want, Harlan?" Jonas's voice was steady, but Clara could hear the underlying tension. Harlan's laugh drifted down from the stairs. "What I've always wanted, to tie up loose ends. You see, I had a very nice life planned out after dear Elizabeth's unfortunate accident. I was going to be the helpful neighbor, the family friend who looked after the grieving widower and his poor mute daughter. Eventually, perhaps, I might have even married you off to some lonely widow, taken over this nice property when you moved away." Clara could hear him moving closer, his footsteps deliberate and unhurried. "But then," Harlan continued, "your daughter had to start talking again, and to a stranger, no less. That simply won't do. Lydia doesn't know anything." Jonas lied desperately. "Oh, but she does. She knows exactly what happened that night. Don't you, little Lydia?" Clara felt the child press closer, and she wrapped her arms protectively around the small form. In the darkness, she could smell the fear radiating from all of them, sharp and acrid in the close air. "I was very clear about the consequences of talking," Harlan said, his voice taking on that horrible crooning quality Clara remembered from the morning. "But children are so forgetful. Perhaps a reminder is in order." The sound of a match striking filled the room, and suddenly Harlan's face was illuminated in the flickering light. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, a kerosene lamp in one hand and something metallic glinting in the other. It was a hunting knife, its blade catching the lamplight like a promise of pain. "Miss Whitmore," Harlan said conversationally, "I'm afraid you've involved yourself in something that doesn't concern you. But don't worry, your suffering will be brief." Clara's mind raced, searching for some advantage, some way to protect Lydia and Jonas. The child was pressed so tightly against her that Clara could feel her rapid heartbeat, could sense the terror that threatened to overwhelm the small body. "You won't get away with this," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Mrs. Hensley knows about our suspicions. If we disappear..." "Mrs. Hensley is a lonely old woman who sees conspiracies in every shadow," Harlan interrupted. "Her testimony would be worthless even if she lived to give it." The casual threat against their neighbor sent ice through Clara's veins. How many people would die to protect this monster's secrets? Jonas made his move then, lunging forward in an attempt to tackle Harlan while the man was distracted. But Harlan had been expecting it. He sidestepped with fluid grace and brought the knife up in a vicious arc. Jonas cried out as the blade found its mark, dark blood immediately staining his shirt. He staggered backward, clutching his side, but remained on his feet. "Papa!" Lydia's scream pierced the air, the first truly loud sound Clara had heard from the child. Harlan's smile was triumphant. "There's my vocal little bird. I was wondering when she'd find her voice again." Clara made a desperate decision. Pushing Lydia behind her, she grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace and swung it at Harlan with all her strength. The heavy metal connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a curse of pain and rage. "Run!" Clara shouted to Lydia. "Hide in the cupboard like Mama told you!" But the child seemed frozen with terror, unable to move as the violence exploded around her. Clara swung the poker again, but this time Harlan was ready. He caught her wrist and twisted cruelly, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. "Foolish woman!" he snarled, his cultured facade finally cracking to reveal the savage beneath. "You could have died quickly. Now you'll suffer for your interference." He raised the knife, its blade aimed at Clara's heart. But before he could strike, the sound of a gunshot thundered through the room. Harlan spun around, a look of shock and pain replacing his confident sneer. Jonas stood swaying near the rifle rack, smoking weapon in his hands, dark blood spreading across his shirt, but his aim still true. The bullet had caught Harlan in the chest, but the man was still standing, still holding the knife. With a roar of rage, he lurched toward Jonas, desperate to finish what he'd started. Clara didn't think, she simply moved. Throwing herself between Harlan and Jonas, she felt the knife slide between her ribs with a sensation like cold fire. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, driving her to her knees as warmth spread across her side. But her sacrifice had given Jonas the seconds he needed. The second gunshot was even louder than the first, and this time Harlan Danner crumpled to the floor like a marionette with severed strings. For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling outside and the harsh breathing of the wounded. Then Lydia's voice rose in a wail that seemed to contain all the grief and terror she had held inside for 3 long years. "Mama Clara, don't go to the cold place. Please don't go!" Clara tried to speak, to reassure the child, but the pain in her side made breathing difficult. She could feel Jonas's hands on her, pressing something against the wound to slow the bleeding, but his own injury was making his movements clumsy and weak. As darkness began to creep in around the edges of her vision, Clara heard Harlan's voice, weak but still venomous with spite. "You'll never be free of this," he gasped, blood frothing at his lips. "I left evidence, letters that implicate Jonas in Elizabeth's death. Hidden where?" "They'll be found when I don't. Return home." Jonas leaned over the dying man, his gray eyes blazing with fury. "Where?" Harlan's laugh was a wet, horrible sound. "Go to hell, wondering." With that final act of cruelty, Harlan Danner's eyes went vacant, and the monster who had terrorized the McGraw family for 3 years breathed his last. Clara felt consciousness slipping away, but she forced herself to focus on Lydia's face. The child was kneeling beside her, tears streaming down her thin cheeks as she called Clara's name over and over. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara whispered, using what might be her last breath to keep a promise. "I'm not leaving you, sweetheart." As the world faded to black, the last thing Clara heard was Lydia's voice, stronger and clearer than it had ever been, calling out a single word that broke and healed Jonas's heart simultaneously. "Mama!" The storm raged on outside, but in the blood-stained room, a family that had been broken by violence was finally beginning to heal, if they could survive the night. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days, her body fighting the fever that had set in after Harlan's knife found its mark. In her lucid moments, she was aware of Jonas's gentle hands changing her bandages, of Lydia's small voice reading aloud from her mother's Bible, and of the warmth of the fire that never seemed to die. When the fever finally broke on the 4th morning, Clara opened her eyes to find Lydia curled up asleep beside her on the bed, one small hand resting protectively on Clara's arm. Jonas sat in a chair nearby, his own bandaged torso visible beneath his open shirt. Dark circles under his gray eyes, testament to the nights he'd spent watching over both of them. "How long?" Clara whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Jonas leaned forward, relief flooding his features. 4 days. We weren't sure." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but Clara understood. They hadn't been sure she would survive. Harlan, dead, buried him behind the woodshed yesterday. Jonas's voice was flat, matter of fact. Mrs. Hensley came by when the storm cleared, helped with everything. Clara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her side. Jonas was beside her in an instant, his strong hands helping her settle back against the pillows. "Easy," he murmured. "The knife went deep, but it missed anything vital. You'll heal, but it'll take time." Lydia stirred at the sound of their voices, her dark eyes opening to focus immediately on Clara's face. When she saw that Clara was awake and alert, the child's face lit up with a joy so pure it brought tears to Clara's eyes. "Mama Clara!" Lydia threw her arms around Clara's neck with careful gentleness, as if afraid she might break. "You came back. You didn't go to the cold place." Clara hugged the child close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair, and marveling at how naturally the word "mama" fell from Lydia's lips. "I promised I wouldn't leave you. Didn't I?" Over the next week, as Clara slowly regained her strength, the full story of what had happened during her illness emerged. Mrs. Hensley had indeed arrived the morning after the confrontation, drawn by worry when she'd seen the smoke from Harlan's signal fires, but no sign of life from the McGraw house. She'd found Jonas barely conscious from blood loss, Clara burning with fever, and Lydia trying valiantly to care for them both. The tough old woman had immediately taken charge, cleaning wounds, fighting Clara's fever with cool cloths and willow bark tea, and sending her own hired hand to town for the doctor. More importantly, Mrs. Hensley had helped Jonas search Harlan's cabin while Clara recovered. They'd found the evidence Harlan had mentioned with his dying breath, forged letters supposedly written by Elizabeth, claiming to fear for her life because of Jonas's violent temper and drinking. The letters were expertly crafted lies, but convincing enough to destroy Jonas's reputation and possibly see him hanged if they'd been discovered by the wrong people. He planned it all, Jonas told Clara one evening as they sat by the fire, Lydia contentedly drawing pictures at the kitchen table. Even from the beginning, he had a way to frame me if anything went wrong. If he'd succeeded in killing us, those letters would have been found, and everyone would have believed I'd murdered Elizabeth in a drunken rage, then killed you and Lydia in guilt and madness before taking my own life. Clara shivered at the calculated evil of it. But they're destroyed now, burned to ash, Jonas confirmed, along with some other things we'd found, items that belonged to Elizabeth, trophies he'd kept, and a journal where he detailed what he'd done to her that night. Clara didn't ask for specifics. Some knowledge was too dark to bear, and Elizabeth deserved to rest in peace now that justice had finally been served. As Clara's strength returned, so did the question of her future. The practical arrangements she'd made with Elias Carter still existed, and she knew she should send word about her delayed arrival. But every time she thought about leaving the McGraw ranch, about abandoning this wounded family just as they were beginning to heal, her heart rebelled. It was Lydia who finally forced the issue. Clara was sitting on the porch one afternoon, enjoying the weak spring sunshine, when the child approached with a sheet of paper in her hands. She'd been drawing almost constantly since Clara's recovery, as if trying to purge years of stored trauma through art. "I made this for you," Lydia said shyly, holding out the paper. Clara took it and felt her breath catch. The drawing showed 3 figures standing in front of the McGraw house, a tall man, a woman in a blue dress, and a small girl holding their hands. Above them, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a 4th figure with wings and a gentle smile, Elizabeth, watching over the family she'd left behind. "It's our family," Lydia explained unnecessarily. The family Mama would want us to be. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she studied the simple but powerful image. Sweetheart, it's beautiful, but I'm not sure. Don't you want to be our family? Lydia interrupted, her voice taking on the edge of panic that still appeared whenever she feared abandonment. Don't you love us? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with years of loss and hope. Clara looked into Lydia's dark eyes and saw her own future reflected there, not the safe, practical marriage she'd planned, but something infinitely more precious and terrifying. Yes, Clara whispered. I do love you, both of you. Lydia's smile was radiant. Then why do you want to leave? It was a child's logic, simple and unarguable. Clara had no answer except the truth. Because I'm scared, she admitted. Scared that I'm not good enough, not whole enough, to be the mother and wife you both deserve. Lydia studied her with a serious expression that made her seem far older than her 6 years. Mama Elizabeth couldn't have babies either, she said matter-of-factly. But she loved me anyway. Love doesn't come from your belly, Mama Clara, it comes from your heart. The profound wisdom of the statement, delivered in a child's clear voice, broke something loose in Clara's chest. She pulled Lydia into her arms and held her close, finally understanding what Jonas had tried to tell her days earlier, that families were built on choice and love, not biology and obligation. That evening, Clara made a decision that would change all their lives forever. She sat down at the kitchen table and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Elias Carter, explaining her situation and apologizing for the broken arrangement. It was a difficult letter to write, knowing it might leave him disappointed and angry. But Clara included enough money to cover his expenses and a sincere wish that he would find happiness with someone better suited to his needs. The second letter was much shorter and went to the territorial courthouse, requesting the forms necessary to legally adopt Lydia McGraw. Jonas found her sealing the letters as he came in from evening chores. He read the addresses on the envelopes and went very still. Clara, he said carefully. What are you doing? She looked up at him, seeing the man who had shown her that damage didn't mean worthless, that love came in many forms, and that sometimes the best families were the ones you chose rather than the ones you were born into. I'm coming home, she said simply. Jonas stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, he crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Are you sure? This life, it's not easy. The winters are hard. The work is endless. And there are no guarantees. Clara reached out and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palms. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I want to build something beautiful here, with you and Lydia. I want to plant Elizabeth's fruit trees and teach Lydia to read and grow old, watching Montana sunsets from this porch. Jonas closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. I love you, he whispered. I didn't think I'd ever be able to say those words again, but I love you. Clara Whitmore. And I love you. Jonas McGraw. Clara replied, sealing their fate with a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning when the aspens had turned gold and the first snow dusted the mountain peaks, Clara walked down the aisle of the small church in town. She wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool, her dark hair adorned with the last wildflowers of the season. Jonas waited at the altar in his best suit, his eyes never leaving her face as she approached. But it was the sight of Lydia that brought tears to Clara's eyes. The little girl walked ahead of her, carefully scattering rose petals on the wooden floor. Her auburn hair was neatly braided with ribbons, and her new dress was the soft blue of a summer sky. Most importantly, her face glowed with happiness as she performed her role in creating the family they had all chosen. When Reverend Matthews asked who gave the bride away, Lydia's clear voice rang out across the small congregation. I do. I give Mama Clara to Papa so we can be a real family. There wasn't a dry eye in the church as Jonas and Clara exchanged vows that promised not just to love each other, but to honor the memory of Elizabeth while building something new and beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. as they walked out of the church as husband and wife, with Lydia between them holding both their hands. Clara looked back once at the cemetery where Elizabeth McGraw rested beneath a simple stone marker. The autumn wind seemed to carry a whisper of approval, and Clara could have sworn she saw a figure in white standing among the golden aspens, smiling with peaceful joy. That evening, as they sat together on the porch of their home, for it was truly home now, watching Lydia play with a new kitten Jonas had surprised her with, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. She had set out to become a mail-order bride, seeking safety and security in a practical arrangement. Instead, she had found something far more precious, a love born of shared struggle, a family forged in the crucible of loss and healing, and a future bright with possibilities. "No regrets?" Jonas asked softly, following her thoughts as he so often did. Clara leaned into his warmth, watching Lydia laugh as the kitten pounced on a fallen leaf. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and magnificent, painted gold by the setting sun. "None," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I belong." As if in agreement, Lydia looked up from her play and called out, "Mama, Papa, come see what Whiskers can do." And hand in hand, Clara and Jonas went to join their daughter in the simple joy of a family evening, knowing that sometimes the most beautiful destinations were the ones you never planned to reach. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Sonnet 4.